Well, welcome. Nice little community that we have here. And welcome to Christine. It's always a pleasure to introduce a fine author, which I think we have here today, but it's a particular pleasure to introduce someone who's become over the years a good friend. Christine and I have spent many happy hour, so to speak, over meals discussing ideas for books and how exactly those books might be developed. In fact, we together may have one of the longer histories and gestation periods for certain books. I think it's just been great. But as part of that, we've also gotten to know each other more personally. We've shared things in our personal lives. She knows a great deal about my family situation, and I know a fair bit about hers. We both have to deal with aging parents and so on, so that's always been a kind of point of contact between us, as have a number of other things. And really, to know Christine is to know an academic for whom obviously human concerns weigh deeply. Her books are an indication of that and are a natural follow-up. Her academic work is a natural follow to her personal interests. From a publishing standpoint in particular, it's always rewarding to feel associated with a book that is splendid, but it's particularly rewarding, I think, to be associated with a book that I think has changed the landscape in certain ways, and not every book does that. I can think, and I think those of us who are here from Eerdmans can think of books on our own list that we feel have changed the discussion. They've gone beyond just being excellent to game changers. And I think that Christine's first book with us, Making Room, did that, and that's a widely shared view in the academy and the church. It's a book that retrieved a tradition that had fallen into disuse or misunderstanding in a way that is, I think, been a rich blessing to the academy and to the church, and she can talk a bit more about that if she wishes. Christine is, as you will know if you read the copy of her book, she's the Associate Professor of Social Ethics at Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky, where it's maybe warmer than it is here. She's been there, I think, since '89. And she's also currently, and I don't know how reluctantly, serving as Associate Provost at the seminary, administrative job. They know when they have someone who can understand human nature as she does, they of course have to make use of that person in administration as well. She's the author or co-author of 4 books, 2 of them with us and 2 of them with a certain publisher in Downers Grove. Those are the ones that she co-wrote. The ones with us you will hear about. The other ones are entitled Living on the Boundaries, Evangelical Women, Feminism, and the Theological Academy. And then she wrote one with a person to whom she introduced me, Chris Hertz, Friendship at the Margins. She's a frequent speaker on the subject of hospitality and related things in a whole variety of places in the academy and in the church. She was recently in Grand Rapids, beginning to be a native here at the Worship Symposium at Calvin. Perhaps some of you have heard her there. And I can't resist adding that in an earlier life, she was a bookstore manager. So welcome home, Christine, to your first love.
You'll have to tell me, is that loud enough? Does that work okay? All right. You guys don't want to move in, or you need to escape? You can escape even if you're in the middle.
This is about community.
That's right. I'm a teacher. I have to have people in front of me. Really, you can leave though if you need to, if that's why you're sitting on the edge. So, I'm very happy to be here and to have this chance to talk about living into community and to dialogue. So I expect to do maybe 20 minutes or so of talking, but then open it up to questions. And I'm happy to engage also about making room, if that's the main book that you've kind of interacted with. But Jesus said that the testimony, the goodness of our shared life, our life together, is actually the best demonstration we can offer that he has come into the world, that God sent him into the world. And if it's true then that how we structure our lives together in the church, in families, in communities, in organizations like Asbury or Eerdmans, if that's somehow central to the truth of the gospel, then I have wondered why we actually don't spend more time reflecting on the nature of our communities, and why we so often run into difficulty with community life. Since really I was a teenager, I have wanted to be part of a vibrant Christian community, some vibrant Christian congregation. It's always seemed to me that that was the most interesting place to be, that was where life happened, where you got to glimpse the kingdom as it was being experienced now, and people could be transformed and share their gifts and so on. That somehow or other, when we did that, when we found those kind of vibrant communities, we were in a sense living into the biblical intentions for us. And so I discovered pretty early the joy of being part of some of those vibrant communities. I really have been blessed with those experiences. Early on, was part of a multi-ethnic church for quite some time, where I learned just the joy of being with people who are very different from myself. Also, some of the challenges of that, but the excitement of being part of a Christian community that seemed like it was giving you a glimpse of the kingdom. It wasn't always easy. It was great. And I think I was part of a generation, sort of coming of age in the 60s and 70s, that really thought that if we worked at it, we could kind of replicate the church in the Book of Acts, you know. And so we kind of keep trying. I found myself regularly attracted to people who were thinking about community, who were willing to experiment with different forms of church, with different dimensions of congregational life, and particularly with people who were offering hospitality, and often hospitality kind of at the margins. People who wanted, in a way, to recover some of the church's more radical character. But just about all of the communities and churches and Christian organizations I've been part of, and at this point in my life, it's actually quite a few, I have also been part of major meltdowns. I'm not sure that I can think of a single one that didn't at some point go through a profound upheaval, in which relationships were really fractured, in which the recovery from it sometimes was very bad, and sometimes there was not recovery. It really was the dissolution of the community. In other cases, the community kind of came through and moved on. But the biggest meltdown that I experienced was in the best community. And so I think that God has blessed me with a fairly sober view of Christian community. But one of my really big questions coming out of that experience, of the beauty and difficulty of Christian community, was how people who really wanted to live into the kingdom, to live in community with one another, who wanted to be faithful, ended up also having such serious problems, and sometimes ended up behaving so badly with one another. So I've been worrying about community for a very long time, trying to understand the relational dynamics that make it possible to sustain communities, and some of the dynamics that actually tear them apart. And so when I was working on my first book, on Making Room, on hospitality, I spent quite a lot of time interviewing practitioners of hospitality. I went to, I think, 8 communities of hospitality. So this is people who do hospitality as a way of life, and are welcoming strangers, significant numbers of strangers in need. So homeless people, people with disabilities, refugees, and so on. And I wanted to know what made it possible for them to practice hospitality in the contemporary world and over the long term. All of these communities have been doing it for at least 15 years, but many for 30 years, 40 years. And I was interested in what allowed them to sustain work. And there were a couple of responses that were consistent across the communities. One was hospitality was the best and hardest thing they'd ever done. And I thought that was really interesting, the best and hardest. And often I think that does travel together. And then a number of them said they couldn't have done it without the support of a community. Okay, that makes sense, especially when you're welcoming lots of strangers. But then they followed that, a number of them followed that by saying sustaining community was harder than welcoming strangers. And that to me was a very important clue that there was something else that I kind of had to address. I'd sort of taken on the hospitality, recovering the tradition. But if the very practitioners of hospitality, the ones who knew community was important, were the ones who also were saying it was the hardest thing, that was even more difficult than hospitality, then I needed to pay attention to the issues that were there. And so in addition to the insights that I gained from these practitioners, I also myself had worked for years in ministry with refugees, with homeless people, and so on. And so I knew some of the challenges of hospitality and community from my own experience. And then I had been involved in these various churches and communities and organizations over the years. So I knew what the practitioners were saying. And then now there's the fact that for almost 25 years I've been teaching in Asbury. So I have this cohort after cohort of students who come through and talk to me about their ministry experience and some of the challenges that they encounter in ministry, some of the incredibly beautiful things that happen, and it's almost sometimes also some of the very difficult ones. And then the other thing that kind of helped frame my thinking about living into community, the book, was that the number of people that are actually writing about community at this point. It's, in ethics, in theology, in biblical studies, there is a renewed interest in community. You see that in the writings of the new monasticism, sometimes in the emergent materials. You see it in N.T. Wright, in Stan Hauerwas, in Robert Weber, and a whole host of others who actually are arguing that our congregations and communities are the most important apologetic we can offer for the gospel. And so sometimes when I read that, I think, oh God, help us. If community is so hard and that's the best apologetic we can offer, then we do have some challenges here to deal with. And also, again, in my experience with students, the interest in community among the sort of the present generation is very high. I mean, I think people are tired of the hyper-individualism and the isolation, and really are yearning for communities. I don't think that they necessarily have the skills they need to create the very communities they long for. And so it seems to me that oftentimes people are captured by sort of an idealization of it. They have a picture, right? A dream of what it might be about. What I wasn't expecting that I found was that there is another whole group of people who really are fairly satisfied with a very thin version of community. They're okay with congregational life that involves basically a worship service on Sunday. And so they're not particularly concerned. And so that actually, it seems to me, is also another concern, but it kind of comes from the other direction. But neither group seemed particularly willing to work very hard at cultivating the skills or practices that would make community life good. And I think, as I say in the book, it seems to me that good community life emerges at the intersection of divine grace and steady human effort. I mean, it's not something that we do ourselves, but there are ways in which we really have to be intentional about it for it to be good. But I don't think community is optional for us if we want to be faithful to Christ. Deciding that it's too much trouble to persevere in community isn't really an alternative. We're not really free to pursue some isolated individual spirituality. I think the whole discussion recently about being spiritual without being religious is really that. I mean, it's mostly people who have some spiritual inclinations but are avoiding the connections and the demands of community life. But we are the embodiment of Jesus in the world, both individually and collectively. And John describes Jesus as full of grace and truth, which means that somehow grace and truth need to be at the center of our identities, at the center of how we live together. So if community was what we were made for, and congregational life is crucial to our Christian identity, then in community we are, in a sense, the social organization of who Jesus is. And that's really the body of Christ, right? So the challenge for us is that the ways that we have been formed by our own culture really have not prepared us well to be part of the very communities that we want and want to create. We might want community, but it's often community on our terms, with easy entrances and exits, with lots of choice and support and minimal responsibilities. And as one person put it, we want to be connected without being encumbered. And I think that's probably a pretty good description of it. We want the connection, we don't want the responsibilities. And this is not a promising recipe for strong communities. So if we realize that there are some difficulties, there are several different ways that we process the challenges we face in community life. And I think when congregations or when families encounter difficulties, we tend to use kind of the dominant lenses of the culture. And I think churches, just like families, either move toward kind of a therapeutic psychological lens, and they talk about dysfunctional personalities or codependent behaviors or whatever when they're trying to figure out what's gone wrong in a community. Or they use business models, sort of management kind of paradigms to sort it through. And I don't think there's anything wrong with those. I just don't think they're adequate. They're not enough. They don't get us back to the resources of the tradition. They don't connect us with the wisdom of Christians over the centuries. The reality is that Christians have never gotten community life exactly right. Not in the early church, not in the biblical text, not in the early church, and certainly not in our day. It really is only by grace and forgiveness and confession and correction and repentance that we're ever able to move forward. There are flashes of extraordinary beauty, but good communities have to address and absorb the difficulties. And they don't trample the fragile goodness of the community, nor give up on it in search of something better. So instead they forgive and they repair, we repent and rebuild. So, getting back to my own story, the question for me was, how do you get at issues of community life that avoids abstractions and idealizations, that doesn't just say hopeful or pious things, but also takes seriously the difficulties? And what could you do that would really learn from the tradition and yet value community life in the contemporary setting? And as I was working on making room on hospitality, I was drawn into a group of scholars and pastors who were working on the importance of Christian practices. Things like hospitality, Sabbath, testimony, singing, discernment, forgiveness, and so on. And these were people who very particularly wanted to connect theology and everyday life. That was what they were really intentional about. And they thought it could be done through the notion of practices. And Craig Dykstra, the Lilly Endowment, Dorothy Bass, and some other folks had developed an understanding of practices that were basically things that people do together over time in light of God's word and work in the world. And so I think, so what are the practices? What are the things people have done together over time that have made community life good or possible, and what are the ones that have made it difficult? So eventually, I was asked to do a book on promising, and I wasn't really well excited about writing a book on promising. I don't know why, but it didn't really capture my imagination. But I did start to think that I would be willing if I could connect it to community in some explicit way. But then as I started thinking about promising in the context of community, very quickly I realized that you can't really talk about promise making and promise keeping separate from truthfulness. Because in the scripture, promising and truthfulness are oftentimes intertwined. The Bible links them closely, so fidelity and truthfulness. And as I reflected on promising and truthfulness, I realized how often the difficulties in community life were related to some form of betrayal or some form of deception. by betraying the promises we've made, the commitments we've made, or deceiving one another. And I was already persuaded of the importance of hospitality. And then later in my reflections, I realized that communities that don't practice gratitude, communities in which there's a sort of a culture of entitlement or envy or lots of grumbling, really become unbearable very quickly. Those are not pleasant places to be. And so I started to think that gratitude might actually be a key practice within community. So in terms of all of this, I was blessed to get a Lilly grant to do some research, but what was distinctive about it was it brought together, I was able to bring together a group of pastors who were just people who were, the one criteria that I had was that they were already doing some kinds of hospitality, because I thought that would surface some of the other practices. And so we had about 12 pastors, several other academics, and then a couple of leaders of intentional communities. And we were able to gather together over several years, and each time we gathered, we talked about a different practice. And so I had identified these that I wanted to look at: promise keeping, promise making and promise keeping, truthfulness or living truthfully, gratitude, and then sort of hospitality again. I think if there is wisdom in this book, it's because we did it together. It's because we really started kind of from the ground. And one of the things that we did was, each time we were looking at a practice, we asked the people before that they would work within their congregations and look to identify an incident of promise keeping, promise making and promise keeping, or betrayal, and to recount that in just a page or two, and to tell us. And then what we took were those essays. We would have like about 18 essays each time. And we read through them, and it was not to do kind of problem solving. It wasn't to fix whatever had happened. It was to learn about what that practice looked like in that grounded, ordinary dailiness of being a congregation together. That turned out really to be very fruitful. It surfaced very interesting things. It particularly showed how the practices intersected with each other. So when there was an issue of promising, there was also often some question about hospitality or gratitude or truthfulness or whatever. But together, looking at the practice or its deformation in life together, what was going on, the other practices, and so on, actually helped to contribute to a general, a more richer understanding of each practice. And once we started doing it, as is often the case when you have a topic that you're looking at, we discovered that it's everywhere, right? All the time people are dealing with making or keeping promises, that there are issues of truthfulness or little lies or small deceptions, and then having to kind of deal with that. And in fact, in the end, I think what I found most interesting about the project was the places where the practices intersected or collided, or where the deformations of a practice like betrayal collided with trying to practice hospitality or something like that. Each of the practices that I look at in the book have lots of other material written about them in other places. Although it's surprising, at least in the academic world, how much of it tends to be abstracted from everyday life, especially the discussions of truthfulness and promise keeping. But even gratitude is very rarely connected to community in the literature. But really, those are the things that are the stuff of everyday relationships. I mean, you can't really have trusting relations without making promises to one another, right? You can't really proceed in a relationship if you can't be fairly confident about truthfulness. I don't ever think that these four practices are the only ones or the most important ones, but I do think they're central, and I think they hold together. There are other ones that showed up in our work over and over again, particularly forgiveness and discernment. But there is actually much more available to the church on the practices of forgiveness and discernment. But it was surprising how often looking at these practices helped to unpack the difficulties as well as the graces in life together. I discovered as we worked on this material that we tended not to notice when the practices were working well. So actually when we started doing these essays together, and this is, I just found, I'm doing this with my students this semester. So I assign, I say, okay, write in, look for an incident in community life that's related to promising or betrayal. And 3/4 of the essays are on betrayal. We don't actually, if promising works, you don't notice it, right? It's the stuff of everyday relationships. It's the same thing with truthfulness. Even gratitude, we don't, we notice complaint or envy or whatever. We don't notice gratitude as much. So we really had to learn, we had to teach ourselves to notice the good things, to actually be attentive and see when somebody was keeping promises, or when there was truthfulness in a difficult situation, or when there were expressions of gratitude. Because really a combination of grace and truth and fidelity make communities safe enough for people to take the risks that are necessary for growth and transformation. That same combination makes it possible for communities to handle disagreement without coming unraveled, and to minister to the world in ways that are greater than the sum of the individuals involved. So each of the practices is important to the biblical story. You actually do find them all the way through Scripture, and to the expectations, to the teachings about the way the people of God should live in the world. But each of the practices is also at the heart of God's character and activity. When you think about it, we worship a covenant-keeping, a promising God, a God who is true, Jesus who is the truth, a God who is gracious and welcoming. And so the practices have their home, in a sense, in God. And although the 4 practices don't address every aspect of community life, they do hold together. And so a person might work to strengthen one practice, but very quickly you discover the importance of the other ones. So when communities offer hospitality to strangers, it's not long before you realize that deception is an important issue in some of the challenges to community, or truthfulness, or fidelity, or whatever. We discover that speaking truthfully is often risky if we don't have commitments to one another in terms of promises. And I think unless we pay attention to these promises, we're unlikely to be able to stand against the cultural assault on them today. Think about the features of contemporary life, how often we talk about putting the right spin on certain events, right? Even if the spin is deliberately misleading. Or think about how self-actualization defines people's purposes and goals. In such an environment, concerns about fidelity and truthfulness can seem pretty naive. Or how many messages we get daily that we deserve to be happy and we're entitled to success. Or how much advertising encourages envy, which is one of the deformations of gratitude. In such settings, it's hard to remember how life-giving gratitude is. And when we're continually bombarded with warnings about being careful about strangers, hospitality doesn't seem to be the norm. Exclusion seems to be the norm. So we struggle with the practices, but sometimes we deliberately violate them also. So instead of keeping promises, we betray. Instead of truthfulness, we deceive. Instead of gratitude, we complain or become envious. Instead of welcoming, we exclude. And when that happens, the deformation affects our capacity both to engage in other practices, but also it undermines the practice itself. So small deceptions and habitual grumbling, again, make the practice of hospitality difficult. But even something as ordinary as complaining can become a way of life, kind of undermine a community. So sometimes the practices are undone by sin. Other times they're made more complicated simply by virtue of what they are, by our finiteness or our frailty. We struggle with some of them, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So let me just talk a little bit about the structure of the book, and then we'll open it up to discussion. So in structuring the book, I, with the help of some good friends here, decided to do 3 chapters on each of the practices of promising, truthfulness, and gratitude. And so in the first section, kind of try to map out something of a biblical and theological understanding, a moral understanding of the practice, and then look at the cultural values and assumptions that actually challenge the practice, make it more difficult today. So how to think about gratitude in a culture of entitlement, or how to understand promises when a main value today is keeping our options open. It really changes how people think about promising. If the main thing is to keep options open and not to make commitments, or how to understand truthfulness when we Photoshop our vacations pictures, right? So it changes, the culture itself is affecting the practices pretty significantly. But each of the practices, and this is the second chapter on each of the practices, is complicated as we try to live them out. So if we're supposed to be grateful, if gratitude really is part of what it means to be a Christian, then why do we struggle with some gifts? You know, the whole notion that gifts don't have strings attached is really an interesting one, because really gift giving is about relationship building and strengthening. So there's all sorts of complexity with gifts and gratitude and so on. It's not as simple as sometimes we think. In promising, what do we do with conflicting promises? You know, we make commitments in the midst of other commitments, and sometimes they collide into each other. And it's not because of sinfulness, it's just because you can't necessarily be in two places at once or whatever. So do we have to keep promises that we don't like anymore? What do we do with the promises we can't keep? And then what does it mean to speak the truth in love when the dedicated church pianist really blows the offertory? You know, how do you kind of process that in a community? Or when we're dealing with misconduct, how do you deal with truthfulness in love when there are innocent family members that are also affected? You know, those are difficult questions. And then in the third chapter on each of the practices, I try to address the deliberate deformations. So address envy and ingratitude, grumbling, and so on, or betrayal or abandonment in the case of promising, and deception and self-deception in the case of truthfulness. And then finally, in the last part of those chapters, ask how we can strengthen those practices in our community. What are some of the practical things that people are doing to create cultures of grace and truth? And then in the final chapter, because I did a whole book on hospitality, it didn't seem sensible to sort of do that as fully again. But I used the last chapter on hospitality to actually sort of map out a little bit about the history of the practice. But then to take the questions over the years when I've presented on hospitality so much, the questions that people ask become somewhat predictable, right? Well, what about the risks? What if we don't have enough? You know, those kinds of things. And I realized as I reflected on them when I was thinking about the other practices that most of the time those issues have to do with other practices and how they're intersecting with hospitality. So when we're worried about risk, it's often related to deception. When we worry about enough, it's probably related to some of the issues around discernment and Sabbath, which weren't practices that I was looking at particularly, but they sort of shows the way in which multiple practices engage. So anyway, I think that might be a place to stop and to invite people to ask questions or have comments or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, well, excuse me. Through the years, I have been churched, but I never really followed my own journey and where I wanted to be and all that until I retired.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started interacting with some communities outside of my comfort zone, which street people, that sort of thing. And I found that, you know, within a church, you can say all you want about what you believe and follow in Jesus' paths and quote the Bible and do all that. But what really matters is how you relate to the community you are in and the community you reach out to that has less than you. The poor are always with us and that sort of thing. And I am very blessed, though, to belong to St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. And our rector and the people in our church community are so outreach. I mean, it's overwhelming almost sometimes, but very many things that you say just click, click, click.
Oh,
I can go back and look at where I was and where I thought the church was many years ago, and get up to now, there's a lot going on that needs to be taken care of.
Mhm.
But it's outside the church that most of the living, what Jesus asks us to do, takes place. That's just the way
Well,
I have come to
I
realize
think
for
you've
myself.
gotten at an important point, and that is that it seems to me there's this constant tension or balance between cultivating a good life within the Christian community
Right.
and cultivating our ministries and so on, and that they both have to be attended to.
Yes,
And I think there
exactly.
are some people who are sufficiently outward focused that they forget about.
Right, no.
So it's not worth the time to sort of address the internal issues, and yet it is.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, you want to be a community into which people really want to come and can
Absolutely.
stay. But the other idea is that you can be so focused on the internal dynamics of the community that you sort of forget about looking outward, and that also is part
Well,
of
you
that.
have to, your church community in its existence has to be inclusive.
Yeah.
It just has to be.
Well, it does,
Is it
and yet at the
inclusive?
same
Yeah, I
time,
know,
there is
I
an
know there's
identity.
issues. Yes,
There is an
I know.
identity worth preserving,
I know.
and so I think
Yes,
those
I
are.
understand that too.
Yeah.
I understand
Yeah,
that too.
good, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about the concept of covenant and the expectation to have, since we're in a dynamic situation, in most churches, to have a covenant up front that people are cognizant of, and what the obligation is to share in common beliefs before you make a commitment to a community, or can you do it more dynamically?
This is a very big conversation at this point, isn't it? That historically, I think we have thought that people believed first and then belonged, and yet many of the patterns today are that essentially people are belonging in order to believe, and so that does make it a much more sort of fluid. That you have people at very different points on a spectrum of belief as they're incorporated into the church, and that can make for some pretty complicated dynamics, I think. I was just at Western talking about some of this material the last couple of days, and I was surprised by the number of pastors of what seem to me fairly dynamic churches that are increasingly saying that it's important to articulate a certain set of assumptions and expectations for people, because there's so much struggling with commitments at this point that you almost have to name some of them up front, because otherwise people don't even know what they're supposed to be committed to. And so I think there's some kind of fragile balance there between being open enough to receive people wherever they are in their journey, and yet at the same time helping them to really grow into a particular identity and into a set of commitments that they're willing to keep, that they understand from early on. So in something like people joining small groups, several of them have said that they kind of lay out a covenant structure at the beginning of it to say, this is what we are going to do together, sign on with us. And they have found that helpful. So I haven't really heard that much before, but it makes sense to me in terms of where things are at this point.
Could you build on that a little bit and talk about discipline for those people who are not consistent with the covenant? It's a very difficult topic.
Yeah, it is. It is, and again, communities handle that kind of thing very differently. And I'm afraid that in terms of church discipline, we pick the areas that we're going to discipline people on, and we ignore whole other areas, which makes it all a little bit more messy. I think one of the things that we were talking about the last couple of days is the importance of sort of nurturing a culture of mutual accountability, where people can speak into one another's lives earlier than when it's a disaster, right? So they can know each other well enough to challenge some of the behaviors and the patterns before they sort of explode into real trouble. And so I think that would be part of it. We're a little bit uncertain about how to speak into one another's lives, but I think in cultivating a culture of truthfulness that also is framed in love, people will hear us if they know that we're committed to them. So that's the fidelity and truthfulness piece together. I think it has to be there. Otherwise, speaking the truth, one of the difficulties with trying to cultivate truthfulness at this point, or truthful speech, is that if people don't like what you're saying, they'll just move on to the next place at this point. So the complexity of again, forming cultures of faithfulness, fidelity, and truthfulness is really important. Probably always has been, but you feel it more acutely.
I just have a question for you. When you talk about community, are you talking about the actual church community only? Or are you talking about the greater community that surrounds this entity of St. Andrew's Episcopal or North Park Methodist or Calvin College or any of it? Yeah.
Right. In this book, I certainly have spent my life trying to encourage people to reach out, but in this book I was particularly looking at, well, not just churches, but either congregations or small groups or families, whatever kind of community in which people kind of embed their lives. So there are various levels of commitment in communities, and certainly some of this, I think most of the book is relevant to a Christian organization or family, almost as much as it's relevant to a church. But I wasn't writing it for the larger world, because you got to start somewhere, and I started with fundamentally Christian assumptions.
Right.
So if I were going to talk about sort of faithfulness and truthfulness in the larger community, I would have to make a very different argument. I think you could make it, but it wasn't the one that I was making. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
What else?
Is there maybe a time in the past that you were kind of contrasting your studies currently in community with just the church in general, like, talking 1800s or back? Did you ever do any contrast between now and how the church has expressed this?
Oh, I think there were times where the church as a community understood itself more as a community than now. But I must say that in looking back at whatever period that was, it was always difficult. These issues are just perennial issues in many ways. So I don't think there's some golden age that we can look back to. Like I said, I was one of those people that, the early church. But if you look at the early church, they certainly had a hard time with most of the practices, and yet they were able to move on. The movement came out of them, so they got enough of it right to keep going. But there were real struggles, and so no, I don't think there's a golden age. There are pieces, there are bits in history that provide us with good models. But overall, I think each generation kind of works it out. So, to that extent, I'm as hopeful now for us that we can do this by God's grace as any other time in history. We just have a different set of issues.
We have to hope all things. We have to hope all things.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Two questions actually, though they're not related. I've always been curious. You invited me to come to the last group meeting that you had with your little community that had formed. That always struck me a lot. That
Yeah.
you actually formed a community within it. It was a group that eventually became a community, and I was always curious about how many of the dynamics of community came up, for better or for worse, in the working out of that group. You don't have to be specific, but did that ever become part of your discussion? That here we have an instance where maybe somebody is spinning something, or here we have an instance where community is in some way being threatened, so that the community learn from itself, its own community experience. And she gathered that a whole group, this group of people she's talking about over this period of time, you got to know each other quite well, I have to say.
Yeah, we did get to know each other well. They were occasional meetings. They were just like twice a year, and then we would stay in touch with each other, but it was pretty far spread. So I think where there were those complexities, it was more among the team that led the grant, and there were some very big complexities there at times, and where we had to kind of work through in terms of fidelity, in terms of having committed to a project and how we were going to do this, in terms of truthfulness. Yes, and I think that did inform, in terms of gratitude, actually all of the practices came up for the team, and I think that's true even in a congregational setting, that the place where a lot of these issues surface most quickly is on a staff or in the leadership of the church, because the congregation often tends to be, the relationships tend to be a little bit thinner. Right? It's not the day-to-day intensity unless you have an intentional community or something where people's lives are overlapping. So I would say I've never thought about that question that way, but I think the issues for us surfaced more in terms of the people who were trying to actually run the grant. And I think the resolutions were good, but there was a real learning curve in there to work through some of that. And your other question?
We've had some occasion now to teach this material.
Mm-hmm.
We grew in part out of that. I'm curious.
Pardon?
And the book has grown out
Yeah,
of that
yeah.
as well. I'm curious about whether or not any one of these practices has seemed oddest to your student, has been the hardest one for the boss, or whether they don't seem to connect with it as readily, or do they want to embrace everything you do?
Of course.
Yeah.
What kind of question is that? It's really, that, again, it's an interesting question, and the answer is as puzzling in some ways as the question is. People will say to me, the gratitude piece was fun, but what really got me was truth-telling. That really spoke into my life. And then the next person will come up to me and say, yeah, I kind of got through the promise-keeping stuff, but really what changed my thinking was the gratitude piece. And so actually it has been, and oftentimes it is one of the practices that speaks to somebody, but it's never the same one. So I don't know how to answer that, actually. It really has been pretty even. I think when, I think I would have to say at this point that it's pretty evenly distributed in terms of what people have commented on.
Well, it's interesting. I would have guessed that the gratitude one would have been the one that would have resonated least to students right off. But that one they would have to spend a little more time getting their heads around. But
Even in the grant, I remember one of the guys saying, I thought this was the least interesting one. He said until I started working on it.
Yeah.
And then you start realizing just how much of our life is intertwined either in gratitude or affirmation or the deformations. And so he had come around at the end and really kind of was celebrating that one. So again, it's just kind of funny. I think, it sort of depends on where the person is in their own life journey and which ones they're struggling with, or which ones their church is struggling with, or their community. Yeah.
In this age of the internet, do you think it's viable, possible to have a true community that's like 95% virtual, that meets via website and listserv and email and things like that?
Okay. I don't know. I mean, I think the jury's out. It's hard for me to imagine. I think that the social media and things can reinforce community, face-to-face community. It can form aspects of community, but it's surely not the same thing. So I can't say. I think it's still going to be a little while before we figure out the ways in which the various forms of social media can help build community and what it has done to really undermine face-to-face community. So I think it's going to be cutting both ways. So I'm not very good at it myself, but, you know, all my students, you know, everybody's engaged in it. So we have to take it seriously in terms of what our communities are going to look like in the future. But there've got to be ways in which it has a different impact and it changes how we think about relationships.
It's just much easier to be connected without being accountable.
I think that line actually comes from that, because you can have, you know, you can have 1,000 Facebook friends. What does that mean? But it does give you the sense of connection, but you don't have any responsibility to one another. Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it gives a feeling of belonging, but it's a funny kind of belonging. I mean, it's not there when you're sick, right?
Well, I was just gonna say it was there when I was sick. I mean, it was something I could do when I was ill.
Yes, yes.
Oh,
Okay, all right. So there we go.
Anything but good thing.
Yeah, right. That's true.
What I was gonna say, are you supposed to research everything North American? Is that
What was that?
Is it all North American?
Was my work North
Yeah,
American?
or is it more?
No, this is an ongoing thing. I mean, because the nature of communities and how we live into the practice are pretty culturally situated, you can't do kind of a global thing on community and have it be even vaguely accurate. So yes, this is very much a North American story, and I'm very conscious of that. One of the blessings of my teaching at Asbury is that I have a very international student body. And so some of the questions, in fact, one of the most interesting things is, I'm teaching a course on community right now, and I have a number of students, Korean students, who have a very different experience of community. And in some ways, the givenness of it, but also in some ways the burdensomeness of it. And so some of those questions, it's just, you know, they're important questions for the church. They're not the ones, you know, when you're sort of, in some ways, kind of breaking ground on some of these issues, you can only do a certain amount. And so I would like to explore that more, but I started with what I knew.